It's the 1980s in Seattle, Washington, a time of growth and prosperity for many. But beneath the surface lurked one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. For nearly 2 decades, a predator stalked the streets, targeting vulnerable women and leaving their bodies along the Green River. His reign of terror would claim the lives of at least 49 victims, though the true number may be much higher. This is the chilling story of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, and the relentless investigation that finally brought him to justice after 20 years of murder. July 15, 1982. The banks of the Green River in Kent, Washington. 2 boys riding bicycles made a grim discovery: the naked body of a young woman floating face down in the water. She was identified as 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield, a troubled teenager who had run away from home. Police initially treated it as an isolated homicide. They had no way of knowing this was just the first victim in what would become one of the longest and most complex serial murder investigations in American history. August 12, 1982. Less than a month after Caulfield's murder. The body of 19-year-old Deborah Lynn Bonner was found, also in the Green River. 5 days later, 3 more bodies were discovered in the same area: Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, and Opal Mills. The pattern was unmistakable. A serial killer was at work. King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force, led by Detective Dave Reichert, who would later become a congressman. The investigation would consume his life for the next 2 decades. As the body count rose, a disturbing pattern emerged in the killer's choice of victims. Most were young women involved in prostitution or living high-risk lifestyles along the Pacific Highway South, an area known for its strip clubs and street prostitution. Many were teenagers. All were vulnerable. The killer's method was consistent: strangulation, usually manual, but sometimes with ligatures. He would then dispose of their bodies in clusters around the Green River, the SeaTac area, and later wooded areas around Washington state. In many cases, he would return to the bodies to engage in necrophilia, a detail police withheld from the public. At the end of 1984, the death toll had risen to more than 20 women. The community was gripped by fear. The Green River Task Force grew to more than 50 detectives at its peak. They interviewed thousands of witnesses, followed countless leads, and compiled extensive lists of potential suspects. But the investigation faced significant challenges. Many victims weren't reported missing immediately due to their transient lifestyles. Bodies were often found weeks or months after death, in advanced stages of decomposition, making forensic evidence difficult to collect. The killer left few clues: no fingerprints, no witnesses, just bodies, often posed deliberately, sometimes with objects inserted into them as a sick signature. The task force was overwhelmed with tips and potential suspects. One of them, interviewed multiple times beginning in 1984, was a truck painter named Gary Ridgway. Gary Leon Ridgway was born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1949. On the surface, he seemed unremarkable: a high school graduate with average intelligence who had served briefly in the Navy. He worked painting trucks at Kenworth for nearly 30 years, a steady job that gave him both stability and anonymity. Ridgway had been married 3 times and had a son. Neighbors described him as quiet and polite. Co-workers knew him as a reliable employee who occasionally hired prostitutes. What they didn't know was that behind this ordinary facade lurked a man with a pathological hatred of women, particularly those involved in prostitution. In 1982, Ridgway became a person of interest when a witness reported seeing one of the victims getting into a pickup truck similar to his. He was given a polygraph test, which he passed. In 1984, he was questioned again after another victim was last seen getting into his truck. He provided a saliva sample for DNA testing, but the technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to connect him conclusively to the crimes. The investigation continued, but Ridgway remained free. The case goes cold. By the late 1980s, the killings appeared to slow down or stop. The task force was scaled back as resources dwindled and leads dried up. The Green River Killer case became one of America's most infamous unsolved serial murder investigations. Books were written about it. The story was featured on television shows like Unsolved Mysteries. Many believed the killer had either died, been imprisoned for another crime, or moved to a different area to continue his murderous spree elsewhere. For the families of the victims, there was no closure, only endless waiting and wondering. November 30th, 2001, nearly 20 years after the first body was discovered. Detective Dave Reichert, now Sheriff Reichert, announced a breakthrough in the case. Advanced DNA technology had matched the saliva sample taken from Gary Ridgway in 1987 to semen found on several of the victims. Gary Ridgway, now 52 years old, was arrested as he left work at the Kenworth truck factory, where he had been employed for decades. The community was stunned. The Green River Killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, continuing to live and work in the same area where he had committed his crimes. Facing the death penalty, Ridgway made a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, he agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, confessing to his crimes and helping locate the remains of still missing victims. What followed was one of the most disturbing confessions in criminal history. Over a period of 6 months, Ridgway led detectives to the remains of 4 previously undiscovered victims. He confessed to killing at least 71 women, though he claimed he had lost count of the exact number. He described his crimes in chilling, matter-of-fact detail. He would pick up women, usually prostitutes, have sex with them, and then strangle them, usually from behind. He specifically targeted prostitutes because he hated them and thought they would not be missed. Ridgway told investigators, "I wanted to kill as many women as I could. It was an ongoing thing. I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught." He admitted to returning to the bodies to engage in necrophilia. He would sometimes place objects on or inside the bodies as a way of marking them. Perhaps most disturbing was his complete lack of remorse. When asked how he felt about his crimes, he compared killing women to going to work, just something he did. On November 5th, 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. At the time, it was the largest number of murder convictions for a single individual in American history. In a crowded courtroom, Ridgway sat impassively as the names of his known victims were read aloud, a process that took 10 minutes. For many families, it was the first confirmation that their missing loved ones had indeed fallen victim to the Green River Killer. December 18th, 2003. King County Superior Court. Family members of Ridgway's victims were given the opportunity to address him directly. For 2 days, they stepped forward to confront the man who had caused them so much pain. Some expressed rage. Others shared memories of the women and girls whose lives he had cut short. Many simply asked, "Why?" Ridgway himself spoke briefly, offering a hollow apology that rang false to most in attendance. He showed no genuine emotion or remorse for his crimes. Judge Richard Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 480 years. 10 years for each victim for the crime of tampering with evidence. Judge Jones told him, "The remarkable thing about this case is you felt you had the right to murder these women. You've left a trail of destruction and sadness that is almost incomprehensible to imagine." Gary Ridgway was transferred to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he remains today in solitary confinement, spending 23 hours a day in his cell. In 2011, he confessed to a 49th murder, that of Rebecca "Becky" Marrero, whose remains were found in 2010. He is suspected in dozens of other unsolved murders, but without sufficient evidence to bring formal charges. The Green River Task Force officially disbanded, having finally completed its mission after more than 2 decades. Detective Dave Reichert, who had pursued the case from the beginning, told reporters, "There's a lot of emotion tied up in this case. I've lived with it for 20 years. But this isn't about me. It's about the victims and their families." The Green River Killer case changed how law enforcement approaches serial murder investigations. It highlighted the importance of cross-jurisdictional cooperation and the need for centralized databases to track similar crimes across different areas. It also exposed society's indifference toward marginalized women. Many of Ridgway's victims were not immediately reported missing, and some families complained that police didn't take their concerns seriously because of their loved ones' lifestyles. The case led to improvements in DNA technology and its application to cold cases. The same techniques that finally caught Ridgway have since been used to solve numerous other long-dormant investigations. In the years since Ridgway's conviction, efforts have been made to remember his victims not just as statistics or as prostitutes, but as human beings, daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends whose lives had value and meaning. A memorial was established at the site where many of the victims' remains were found. It serves as a place of reflection and remembrance for families and the community. The Green River Killer case remains one of the darkest chapters in Seattle's history. For nearly 20 years, a seemingly ordinary man committed extraordinary evil, taking the lives of at least 49 women and girls. Gary Ridgway's reign of terror finally ended, not through any remorse or mistake on his part, but through advances in forensic science and the dogged determination of investigators who refused to let the case go cold. The true number of his victims may never be known. Ridgway himself claimed to have killed so many women that he lost count. Some estimates place the total as high as 90 or more. What we do know is that each victim was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. They had dreams and hopes that were cut short by a man who viewed them as objects to be used and discarded. Today, Gary Ridgway sits alone in his prison cell, likely to die there, while the families of his victims continue to live with the pain he caused. The Green River Killer case reminds us of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary facade, and of the importance of remembering the victims rather than glorifying the killer. For the women and girls whose lives were cut short, we remember their names. And for the detectives who never gave up, we recognize their determination to finally bring one of America's most prolific serial killers to justice.